Shaping our future nation. We've got an awesome guest with us today, JasonWHoyt. How are you doing? You actually had a program here on this station in the past, a local station, and now you're online doing all sorts of wonderful stuff, blog talk and everything, right?
Well, actually, I'm doing a radio show at home, kind of a podcast, if you will, American Patriots Radio. And Marshall, I just want to say, I've been on the show with you before, and you are growing leaps and bounds, and you're in how many states now?
Well, four.
Four states. That's awesome. I want to congratulate you on doing such a good job. And
well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate everything that you do to help support the conservative movement, because it's something very important that people need to understand who conservatives are, what they stand for, and you espouse that. So.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, Marshall. Thank you so much.
Now, today we're talking about something very important in the Constitution that not too many people know about, and it hasn't been used to fight government corruption, fraud, waste, abuse, any of that.
Yeah, I mean, to look at this, going back a little bit through my path personally, I've been involved, call it 10 years now, really volunteering like mad, trying to figure out a way to rein in this out-of-control government, if you will, at various levels. And God put me at the right place at the right time. As you know, in 2009, I was fortunate enough to participate in the original conference calls that launched the Tea Party movement. And since that time, look at 2010. We had great gains. It was a miraculous year. Sent 85 Tea Party freshmen to Congress, and the mandate was fiscal responsibility, promoting free markets, and constitutionally limited government.
Well, Jason, if I could just say this, you want to know how successful the Tea Party movement was in 2010. Today, 70%, well, 60 to 70% of Congress is new. That's how successful the Tea Party movement was in 2010. Now, the question is, going forward, what springs out of that?
Well, I think, that's how successful the Tea Party has been to get them there. But once they're there, look, we're still enslaving our next generation with debt. We still have 100 feet of shelf space of regulations. You take 2,000-page bill of Obamacare, and there's this rule-making body that creates 10,000 pages of rules. The EPA is still fining people $500 a day for collecting rainwater in their property. The NSA is still spying on people. The IRS is still targeting people.
So how do we stop it?
And these Tea Party freshmen that we sent to D.C. are still funding it. So,
well, at the same time, though, the president, Harry Reid, kind of have a gun to their head. They're talking about Republican obstructionists.
Well, why have a system of checks and balance if they're not going to check and balance themselves?
Well, I totally agree, but unfortunately, you're going to have to take that up with Harry and Barack. They are.
and look, I think leadership in the House, John Boehner and company, why they're not taking stronger stands. They keep, every time the IRS targets an American citizen based on their political beliefs, we get a couple of chest-pounding YouTube videos from some congressional hearing. But then the next day, the Republican Party, they are sending out fundraising emails. Send more of us to D.C. and we'll finally take on corruption.
Well, that's the Republican Party. But and here's the thing, though. As I look at the situation, Congress, not just this Congress, but going back over 100 years, has ceded so much of their power to the executive branch. At this point, it's very challenging to actually rein that in, regardless of if you have 1 million hearings.
So you're essentially referring to accountability. How do we hold them accountable?
Exactly.
And so, right. That's something we've been saying for years in the Tea Party movement. And you ask folks at FreedomWorks, you ask AFP, Heritage, you ask 912ers and all this. How do we hold them accountable? Because we all say that. We got to hold them accountable to their oath, hold them accountable to the Constitution. And that's the big question, is how. And if they're honest, they'll say it like this. They'll say, well, we have to wait every 2 years. And if we knock on enough doors, and if we make enough phone calls, and we raise enough money, then maybe, just maybe, we might be able to elect the right people. And maybe, just maybe, if we get enough of them in D.C., maybe, just maybe, they'll pass legislation that will reverse the damage and restore our natural God-given rights.
Well, maybe. Even then, let's say you get the Senate, too. Here's the problem. You still have got Barack Hussein Obama in the White House.
Right. So when you look at our founding, you look at how miraculous that was.
Right.
1 minute before the Declaration of Independence, the king was sovereign. 1 minute after, we the people are sovereign. We severed our ties from the tyrannical government. These farmers took on the world's greatest army, defeated them, created our own government, and you cannot convince me that after all of that our founders put in place a system where the only way that we the people can hold them accountable, to hold our government accountable, is by waiting every 2 years and maybe, just maybe, navigating a very narrow and corrupt path, maybe. You can't convince me that that's the only way. And so I've been writing a book. I think I might have told you about that.
In fact, yes, you have. And,
yeah.
and have you come up with a title for it yet?
My working title is How to Save Our Republic, America's War on Statism. And really, I'm talking about a lot of the different movements that are going on in this country right now, taking on, call it tyrannical rule, but taking on the dependence upon the government to solve these problems. And, you know, you've got obviously the tax reform, property rights, there's Common Core, there's all these different issues that people are taking on. And one of them, once I started asking myself that question about accountability, I had kind of a pivot point. And once you ask that question, you say, really, is that how the founders intended us to hold them accountable, is only by voting? So when I started looking out there and I was introduced to a movement that's going on in this country, essentially it's decades in the making, but essentially started last year, this organization called National Liberty Alliance. And these guys have done tremendous work. And so a couple questions that I ask in the book, I say, what if I was to tell you that we the people could operate on an official capacity outside the branches of government and provide our consent to the governed on a daily basis? What if I was to tell you that we the people could reach inside our government and root out corruption with indictments? What if I was to tell you that even the Supreme Court in 1992 said, and I'll quote, "In fact, the whole theory of its function is that it belongs to no branch of the institutional government, serving as a kind of buffer or referee between the government and the people." So what I'm talking about is something that's already in the Constitution, something that the Supreme Court has already ruled exists. So you ask yourself, what is it and why aren't we using it? And so when I say the Constitution matters, the Fifth Amendment right there says, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury." Now, most of the time when people hear about a grand jury, they hear about indictments. Most people today, actually, when they hear indictment, they think, oh, somebody's guilty of something. And all an indictment is where a prosecutor brings evidence to a grand jury. A grand jury is supposed to be made up of you and me, a jury of our peers, but at the grand jury level. They bring an indictment forward. The grand jury looks at the evidence and determines whether or not there's enough evidence to then go to trial, to then be judged by other peers in a petite jury, and then determine whether or not they're guilty.
Well, that's not the, unfortunately, you know, and I hate to go off subject here, a lot of the times,
Yeah.
the indictment, at least for the liberal media, is something that is the actual ruling in a courtroom.
Well, as a society, we look at the indictment
but
and
it
say,
should,
oh, it sounds,
that's right.
It gives us that connotation of, oh,
but
it
it
must
shouldn't
be guilty.
It shouldn't be that way.
Absolutely.
It should be not guilty until proven guilty. So innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. So, but the other word that is in the Fifth Amendment that, you know, even when you ask attorneys today, they don't know what the word means. Presentment. Do you know what a presentment means? Most people don't. When I started defining the words, an indictment again is a charge brought to a grand jury by the prosecutor for approval, but a presentment is a charge the grand jury brings on its own initiative. Grand juries, because the word presentment in the Constitution today, can, by their own initiative, begin to investigate corruption and wrongdoing in government.
So you're saying the jury can go on its own is what you're advocating. So
technically speaking, a grand jury itself can, by its own initiative, begin an investigation. We can look at, say, county seat number 5, you know, the 5th district in the county. The commissioner voted on something and his cousin got the landscaping contract for that. Why? How did that happen? A grand jury themselves can say, you know what, there might be something fishy there. We're going to begin an investigation. But also based on their oath, if a member of the public goes to the grand jury and reports a wrongdoing and says there is corruption, there is criminal activity here, they can, it's not that they can, they have an obligation based on their oath to begin an investigation and look at these things.
Well, here's the only issue that I see with that. You know, when you have a grand jury, they are supposed to be excluded from the rest of the world. They are cut off from some place. And I think if you'll remember during Casey Anthony and during Trayvon, whatever it was going on, they put them in a hotel downtown, and that hotel was supposed to be completely, or at least their rooms were supposed to be completely fenced off. And
but that's not necessarily the grand jury, that's the jury.
That's just the regular jury. Right. Now, I would assume it's the same way with the grand jury, but are you saying that people can actually contact them? Do they have the ability legally, within legal bounds, to contact them to let them know?
Technically, yes, but here's the thing: a grand jury is secret. Nobody knows who's on the grand jury, and when you serve on the grand jury, it's depends on the area, but most places it's here in Florida it's like 6 months. So there's 3 areas I'm looking at that I'm doing research on. Number 1, how are they chosen? How are they selected? Number 2, what instructions are they given? And then number 3 is what functions do they perform? So how are they chosen? It's through the normal jury pool. And then they'll go to you and they'll say, and I'm really simplifying this, but they'll say, actually you've been selected to be on the grand jury, and you serve for 6 months, but most of the time they'll say, don't worry, we won't call you unless there's a murder. That's where they get you. That's where the statutory grand jury, that's where this, and I call it that for a reason. Because the grand juries we have today are puppet grand juries. They're statutory grand juries. They're not based on our common law system, which is what our Constitution is based on.
Sure.
And even in the Supreme Court, Justice Antonin Scalia confirmed that, and I'm going to read you this quote here, the grand jury requires no authorization from its constituting court to initiate an investigation. That's already in the Supreme Court. That's already in the Constitution.
Agreed.
So people today don't know. So even when you're on a grand jury, the instructions are given. They don't realize that they can begin investigations today. So look at like Common Core.
And so are you saying that if we have, let's say we have a corrupt government official outside of the case, but somehow they're money laundering or something in connection to the guilty party or the alleged person.
Correct.
Now, are you saying that you would advocate having the grand jury go and investigate that agency, that individual, but let's say even they do that, the whole point of the case is to find out about that one individual or the one agency who's been brought up as breaking the law or has some sort of corruption.
Yes.
They would really, am I correct in saying this? They need to deal with that person first before they go on a hunt for another person.
It's not about people necessarily.
Sure.
It's about an issue. There is crime, there is activity, and wherever my investigation leads me, all people involved will be held to account. That's what it should be about.
Sure.
I'll give you an example. Look at Common Core, and that's kind of a big example. Let me back up a moment. A police officer who, within his line of duty, within the scope of his responsibilities, if somebody ends up accidentally killed,
Sure.
he is not personally liable for that because he was acting within his scope of his responsibilities. Now, after hours, cop goes to a bar, gets into a fight, hurts somebody, kills somebody. He's not protected because he is acting outside of his scope. And so he will be personally liable, personally held to account for that activity. Same thing with the oath of office. With the oath of office, our elected officials all over the country, fact, the Constitution exists. Fact, every politician who takes office swears an oath to protect and defend, and 99 times out of 100 they put one hand on the Bible and say, so help me God. So if they act outside of their scope, which is protecting and defending the Constitution, that politician needs to be held personally liable.
Agreed.
Article 1, Section 8 of the
totally
Constitution lists 18 to 20 enumerated powers, specifically limiting the scope of the federal government. And if any politician acts outside of that, they as an individual...
And if I could just say, it's not just politicians, we're talking bureaucrats here.
Amen. The Administrative Procedures Act of 1946 created that rule-making body, which essentially should be unconstitutional because we're supposed to look at laws and obey laws from Congress. But what they did was they outsourced it. So that's how they can take a 2,000-page bill of Obamacare and make 10,000 pages of rules and regulations. And Obama doesn't go back and change the law. He, through executive order, changes the rule-making body, changes the rules.
And that's, of course, there is an official term for it, the unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. But the point is, let's say you've got people on a grand jury, right? And I think I know where you're going with this. You're saying that if you see something like Common Core and it's brought to court, or something is brought to court, you can go on that same line of presentment and say, well, Common Core is not something that's constitutional because it's federally, it's inaccurate to do that to the states or whatever.
Absolutely.
Right? Exactly. Now, how are you going to get people to do that? Because my understanding is when you're picking a jury or a grand jury, it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats, it's independents, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, you name it, they try to make it as diverse as possible and as non-conflicting as possible.
In a petite jury, it requires unanimous vote. In a grand jury, it's majority. But sadly, you bring up a very interesting point, and it's very, it's appropriate. Are we the people today? Is our society today ready to push back against tyranny? Do we recognize that our rights come from God, that they don't come from man? Are we ready to push back against the central planners in Washington, D.C.? And I would suggest if you're on a grand jury today, begin investigating. And if you're not on a grand jury today, then send in a criminal complaint to the grand jury foreman. I believe the grand jury foreman, who can be known to the public, send in a complaint to them for their eyes only and say, look, there's criminal activity. Race to the Top was the Trojan horse that made us get Common Core. With
Sure.
Race to the Top,
Sure.
they forced all these states in a poor economic climate to say, yeah, give us the federal money, as if there's ever such a thing as federal money, it's taxpayer money. But they said, yeah, give us the money. And buried in there is, well, if you take the money, then you have to agree to Common Core.
Sure,
that, my
right.
friend, is bribery. That is illegal. So that's something to look at. We
Absolutely.
also need to look at the intimidation by the IRS. We need to look at the EPA and those kind of things acting inside of our state. So there's a lot of corruption that's going on from the federal level, but even locally. We can do these things locally. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you about it today was there's a movement going on in this country, the National Liberty Alliance, really starting this last year, if you will. And they're saying, look, the grand juries today are statutory, they are puppet grand juries through the way they're selected, through the instructions they're given, and for the functions that they do and do not perform. These folks are saying, look, we need to get back to our common law system. We need to get back to creating a grand jury of the people and tackling these issues and investigating them and empowering the people again. And so that's what the National Liberty Alliance is doing. And I believe the count today is like 44 states. Every single county has essentially begun that conversation, begun that process to reconstitute a grand jury based on common law.
Well, that is fantastic. And
Absolutely.
I can't tell you how pleased I am that you came on to discuss this today, because it's something that more people need to understand. They don't understand their government today, unfortunately, the citizens.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned, when are people going to be come to their elected officials, come to the bureaucrats' offices and say, hey, we've had enough.
Yeah.
When are they going to do that? Well, we saw part of that with the Tea Party movement, but with
Yeah.
the everyday people, they're out there and they're just struggling to survive. Some of them are sitting there at home, how am I going to pay this bill, or how am I going to pay that bill? Or for those that are feeding off welfare, they're going to say, hey, you Republicans want to take away my welfare.
Yeah.
That is the sort of thing that we've got to figure out how to educate, as opposed to just speaking at someone.
Absolutely.
That's very important, because once education seeps in, once the truth seeps into people's minds, then when they get on a grand jury or whatever it may be, they'll be able to say, you know what, the federal government shouldn't be mandating a common core, which is really what they're doing. They shouldn't be saying, this is what we need to do at our local level, because what's different for California is shouldn't be the same for Florida. People have different views, different opinions, and if you want to implement some of Common Core in your state, that's fine, but the fact is every state's different. And that's where I think, if the federal government decides they're going to do a program like that, the grand jury, or even the petite jury rather, would have an opportunity to combat that, and even corruption, like you said, from the IRS, which is perfect.
And you kind of brought up the petite jury, and there's two juries that we're talking about, the
Right.
grand jury and
Sure.
the petite jury. And it used to, I ask people all the time, I say, where do you think the jury system came from? Do you think the founders invented it?
No, I did not.
And the answer is obviously no. You go back to the Magna Carta, 1215. You can even find evidence in history where prior to that there's been grand juries or juries where of the people deciding what we're going to tolerate. And even in the jury system, we used to have the ability for centuries prior to our founding, for decades into our founding, where if you're on a jury, you judge the facts of the case and you judge the law. If the law said, you know what, you can't wear blue ties and white shirts anymore, that's against the law. The first person who breaks that law is held to trial before a jury. And if a jury says, you know what, that's a BS law, that's a bogus law, we the people, in offering our consent to the governed, we're not going to be held to account for that kind of a law. Not guilty.
I agree. And here's the other issue that we face today, is not just these juries looking at laws and saying, well, this is a bad law or a good law. The fact is, the way that these laws are written, number one, like you said, they're written to allow bureaucrats to continue to
Yes.
cultivate them. Well, if that's the case, who knows? The law changes from day to day. How is this jury going to know, without extreme legal expertise, exactly what's going on. There's no possible way. You have to practically be a constitutional lawyer or a constitutional scholar to understand it. And even then, people have different views.
Going to dinner with a friend, the gentleman's an attorney. He handles statutory cases. So he's in this incestuous, the statutory, I call it the statutory regulatory industrial complex. It's this whole crazy bureaucratic thing, and he's in the middle of it as an attorney. And I asked him what he thought about the jury system. He says, well, yeah, we got to get rid of the jury system. I was like, well, why is that? I mean, that's the complete opposite direction. And he says, well, just exactly what you said, which was a nice segue to this. He said, you know, the complexities of the law today, how could the average Joe learn it and apply it in such a short amount of time? We need to have professional jurists. And that's the exact opposite.
Because that is an elite group of people. That's exactly what the founders didn't want to happen. They didn't want an elite group or an elite individual to control things, and that's what the liberals and progressives have been trying to institute upon every single person in this country, living and dead, for the past 100 years.
And let me tell you, I've met some amazing people who didn't go to law school. I used to joke, I say, you know, even to that gentleman, I said, you know, I understand you probably don't know a lot about the Constitution. You know, maybe you overslept or you were sick the day they mentioned the Constitution in law school. Because at the end of the day, they swear an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. They don't swear an oath to protect and defend precedent. And so you ask a judge or you ask a lawyer today, what's common law? And he'll say, oh, it's case law, it's judge-made law. No, common law, the way it was defined 150 years ago, is customs and usages by the people, as determined by the people, as the jury offered their consent to the governed at the time, and as the grand jury determined what is and what is not constitutional. That is common law. That's where we, the people, decide to what degree we're going to be held to account for the laws.
Agreed, and unfortunately there's not too many judges out there who actually either understand the concept or want to promote it. We have so many activists or those who are ignorant, and would you believe it, from, you know, if you actually delve into what they're teaching law students today, some law students aren't even taught about the First Amendment. Would you believe that? Some law students
I would.
aren't even taught about the First Amendment, which, by the way, is almost being repealed by the Senate right now. But anyway, but thanks so much for coming on today.
You bet. And if you don't mind, you know, I did a huge blog post this week, which has all this details. And I know you and I threw a lot at your audience in such a short amount of time. Sure. I can send you this link. If you send me a text Hoyt, as my last name is Hoyt, send that to 77948. Again, that's Hoyt, Hoyt, to 77948. And my system will do an automatic reply with this link right here to get that article, and it's got a lot of meat, and it is an early excerpt for release from my upcoming book, How to Save Our Republic, America's War on Statism.
Well, thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Hoyt, and it's JasonWHoyt.com. All right, we'll be back in just one moment, much ahead here on the Marshall Polston Show. Don't go away.